Hello, welcome back to Indus News with me, Osman Lone. Our top story today is with Pakistan and its Foreign Office that summoned India's acting ambassador to protest after Indian attacks across the line of control. During the meeting in Islamabad, Foreign Office spokesman Mohammad Faisal condemned the targeting of innocent civilians in Azad Kashmir by Indian forces.
Office spokesman Mohammad Faisal told Charge d'Affaires Gaurav Ahluwalia that India's deliberate targeting of civilian populated areas is deplorable. He said India's violations are contrary to human dignity and international human rights and humanitarian laws. Faisal warned Ahluwalia that India's ceasefire violations are a threat to regional peace and security and may lead to a strategic miscalculation. Faisal said Indian occupation forces have continuously been targeting civilian populated areas along the line of control and the working boundaries since 2017. He urged India to respect the 2003 ceasefire arrangement in letter and spirit and maintain peace on the line of control and the working boundary. Earlier, Pakistan's military spokesman Major General Asif Ghafoor said 5 civilians and 1 soldier were martyred in the Indian ceasefire violations today. He says 6 other civilians and 2 Pakistani soldiers were wounded in the unprovoked Indian attacks on the Jura, Nowsheri and Shahkot sectors along the line of control. Ghafoor said 9 Indian troops were killed and 2 bunkers were destroyed in Pakistan's retaliatory fire.
Well, for more on this developing story, we're joined by Islamabad by spokesperson of the Foreign Office, Dr. Mohammad Faisal. Dr. Faisal, thank you for joining us in Indus News. So Pakistan has repeatedly warned that India has been planning false flag operations to provoke this kind of escalation that we saw earlier this year. What are India's motives towards this attack?
Yes, the Indian violations of the ceasefire line of control, the ceasefire line, continue, and last night was especially very hot, where it led to many casualties on our side and more than 9 people killed on their side when we retaliated to their unprovoked ceasefire violations and the intended targeting of civilians. We have made it clear to the Indians that any provocation would get a befitting response. As Director General South Asia and SAARC, I just called in the Indian Charge d'Affaires and lodged a strong protest of Government of Pakistan on these ceasefire violations.
Dr. Faisal, Pakistan has, of course, mounted a powerful campaign against India's rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Does the current escalation represent an Indian attempt to distract the global attention towards the curfew and clampdown in the valley?
You're very right that whenever things heat up for the Indian government in Srinagar and in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, they make attempts to distract international attention and they heat up the line of control. And they try to shift the focus to the line of control instead of what is going on in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where 8 million people are kept in a prison. And there's a complete communications blockade, internet blockade, telephone blockade, medicines, food supplies are not being brought to the civilians. It is a huge humanitarian disaster, and this is the Indian attempt to shift attention from what is happening in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir to the line of control.
Dr. Faisal, thank you for that. But let's get more on this with Lieutenant General retired name Khalid Lodi, who's with us. He's a defense analyst and he's been serving in the military for over 30 years in Pakistan. Mr. Lodi, thank you for joining us in Indus News. So tell us, another act of Indian aggression, another ceasefire violation by Indian forces. What do you have to say about this?
The first thing is that this is the only language that Indians understand. We have tried our best to remain peaceful. We have extended the hands of friendship, and they have always, given us negative reactions. Why are they doing it? The basic, we must ponder on this thing that after 76 days of curfew and blackout and all those, things that they are doing to the Kashmiris, they haven't been able to achieve their phase 1 of the objective, and that objective was to martyr or eliminate the leadership and the youth who were carrying out this freedom movement in occupied Kashmir. So in my own assessment, it was a job of 10 to 15 days for such a large force to take to control 450 to 500 maximum people, according to their own numbers, which were carrying out all these freedom movements. So after 76 days, they have not lifted the curfew, means that they have failed in their objective one, the first phase. And out of frustration, they are doing all these things, the one which they are doing today, which they have done today also. But I think this is, one mistake after another mistake, and they'll keep on belittling themselves at international forums. They will keep on belittling themselves in the eyes of the Indians themselves. And what I can see is that all these events are leading towards independence of Kashmir, Kashmir joining Pakistan, and getting out of the clutches of India. So it is their own mistake, and they'll have a bitter lesson after every episode. Yes.
As you mentioned, it's been one mistake after another by India. So what do you think is the purpose of all of this?
Actually, they're trying their best to assimilate whatever they've already done. After revoking 370 and also 335A. Now, of course, their next step would have been that after putting a lot of fear in the hearts of Kashmiris and after getting complete control over the freedom movement, then they would have tried to change the demographic situation of the country. They would have tried to bring more, maybe some investments. But they are failing in even the first, part that is controlling the things. And they have now realized that the morale of Kashmiris is directly related to the way Pakistan is standing with them. And they would like to hurt Pakistan in a way so that Pakistan gets subdued and the Kashmiri morale goes down. That is not going to happen, inshallah. That is what they are trying out of frustration. But this is all, they planned something else, and because of the reactions, events are taking them in some other direction, and that direction, as I said earlier in my own assessment, will lead to emancipation of Kashmiris from their atrocities.
Mr. Lodi, thank you for your analysis and for being with us here on Indus News. Now over to Europe and in the United Kingdom, where hundreds of British Kashmiris have staged a protest in Southampton against India's illegal annexation of occupied Kashmir. The Kashmir Freedom March was held to raise awareness about India's human rights violations in the valley. Demonstrators held placards and banners saying it's time for the UN to act and stop India's torture of civilians. The protesters said abuses of power by Indian forces in the valley are unacceptable. Well, thousands of people took to the streets of Islamabad to show solidarity with Kashmiris. The protesters have unfurled a 5-kilometer-long Kashmir flag. Kashmiris have been living under lockdown since India revoked the territory's autonomy on the 5th of August. The protesters chanted slogans against India's illegal annexation of the valley. They demanded that the Kashmir dispute be resolved according to United Nations Security Council resolutions. A U.S. congressional hearing on South Asia focusing on occupied Kashmir will be held on Tuesday in Washington. In a statement, the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asia, Brad Sherman, said the hearing will review the humanitarian situation in the valley. The statement said the hearing will focus on the valley where politicians are arrested and communications are blocked. It said the hearing will also review the humanitarian situation in Kashmir and whether there are adequate supplies of basic necessities. The people of Kashmir continue to observe a shutdown as a silent protest against India's aggressive actions in the territory. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan says Pakistan will inaugurate the Kartarpur corridor on the 9th of November. In a social media post, he said construction work on the Pakistani side of the border is in its final stage. Prime Minister Khan said the world's largest Sikh temple, known as a Gurdwara, will be visited by Sikhs from across India and other parts of the world. He said the Kartarpur corridor will be a religious hub for the Sikh community and will benefit Pakistan's local economy. Well, a retired Major General of the British Army, Jonathan David Shaw, has said it's time for the world to give more respect to Pakistan. In an article, Shaw wrote the British royal couple's visit to Pakistan shows how the country has transformed its internal security situation. The retired Army General said Pakistan has established internal order under the military command of General Qamar Javed Bajwa. He said Pakistan is working as a vital regional player and has arrested all militants on the US watch list on its territory. Shaw said Pakistan has made huge efforts against terrorism in the past decade and is now not the time to ask more from the country. The EU has decided to forward the UK's draft deal on Brexit to the European Parliament for approval, despite Britain's request for another extension. At a short meeting in Brussels, the ambassadors of the EU states said they would wait for political events to play out in London next week. Earlier, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson sent a letter to the EU requesting an extension to the scheduled Brexit date of October 31st. But he's refused to negotiate a further delay with EU leaders. Well, staying with Brexit, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has sent a request to the EU for an extension to Brexit, but without his signature. The request was accompanied by a second letter by Johnson saying he believes that a delay will be a mistake. He vowed to introduce legislation needed to implement his agreement in Parliament next week. The Prime Minister was required by law to ask the EU for an extension to the 31st of the October deadline after losing a Commons vote yesterday. Conservative lawmaker Oliver Letwin's proposal got 322 votes in favour and 306 against. The amendment has opened a window to push Brexit until the 31st of January next year. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Hello and welcome back to Indus News. Now, Turkey says one of its soldiers has been killed in an attack by the Kurdish YPG militia in northeastern Syria. In a statement, Turkey's defense ministry said another soldier was wounded in the attack on a patrol in the town of Tel Abyad. Earlier, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey will crush Kurdish fighters in Syria if they don't withdraw as per the ceasefire agreement. Turkey has agreed with the United States to pause its military offensive in northeastern Syria for 5 days. The US says nearly 1,000 troops withdrawing from Syria are expected to move to western Iraq. Speaking to reporters, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the move will help Iraq defend itself from ISIS militants. Defense Secretary Esper said he discussed the US troops withdrawal with his French counterpart and the NATO Secretary General. He said there's a consensus between France and the US to jointly defeat ISIS.
I had a discussion last week with my French counterpart, and I had a conversation with the NATO Secretary General. We both agreed on the importance of continuing the Defeat ISIS campaign, and we agreed to have a meeting on it this week in Brussels.
In Lebanon, a government party has quit the coalition after a third day of protest against the country with rising taxes and corruption. In a televised speech, Lebanese Forces Party head Samir Geghea said the government is unable to control the situation. The anti-government protests led to the resignation of 4 ministers in a major blow to the ruling coalition. But the resignations will not collapse the 30-member cabinet. The protesters in Beirut celebrated the news of the coalition party's resignation, calling on other blocs to leave the parliament. Prime Minister Saad Hariri has given a task to coalition partners to find ways to deal with the current crisis. The demonstrators are demanding a sweeping overhaul of Lebanon's political system, citing grievances from austerity measures to poor infrastructure. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Washington remains committed to peace and stability in Afghanistan. His statement comes after 70 people were killed in a suicide attack on a mosque in Afghanistan. Pompeo said the United States will continue its fight against terrorism. He added that the US stands by the people of Afghanistan who only want peace and a future free of violence. The Afghan government has blamed the Taliban for the explosion, which the group rejected, saying a mortar belonging to Afghan forces hit the mosque. In Indonesia, President Joko Widodo has been sworn in for a second 5-year term in Jakarta. The swearing-in was performed at the parliament under tight security of about 30,000 security personnel. In his second and final term, President Widodo has pledged to attract more investment into Southeast Asia's biggest economy. Several foreign dignitaries attended the ceremony, including Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. In Chile, 3 people have been killed by a fire inside a supermarket in Santiago as the protests sparked over the metro ticket price hike. These are the first deaths in 2 days of violent unrest in which protesters burnt the city despite government curfews. Mayor Carla Rubilar says 2 people died at the scene and the third died in hospital. Soldiers and tanks were deployed after the government declared a state of emergency and imposed a night curfew. Well, clashes have erupted for the 20th consecutive weekend between Hong Kong police and protesters. Police fired tear gas at thousands of protesters who vandalized subway stations and shops in rallies across the city. Police used the tear gas on protesters who wore face masks in defiance of a ban that have a penalty of up to a year in prison. The demonstrators threw petrol bombs at a police station, and protesters later blamed Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam for failing to protect their freedom. Hong Kong has witnessed months of protests sparked by a controversial extradition bill. The Spanish government has dismissed calls from Catalonia's regional president to negotiate after days of protests. Demonstrations turned violent after pro-independence Catalan leaders were sentenced to jail. Catalonia's President Quim Torra had requested talks with Madrid, saying the unrest did not reflect the peaceful nature of the independence movement. At a press conference, he said the Spanish government must sit at the negotiating table to resolve the crisis. Responding to this, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said Torra must first unequivocally condemn the unprecedented unrest. The Interior Ministry spokesman said over 300 people have been detained since the protests started. Now, in other news, New York City is known for its arts and culture scene. The Museum of Modern Art has been at the center of the Big Apple's eclectic art scene. The museum is set to reopen this month after an extensive makeover. More in this report.
MoMA reopens on 21st October after a multi-million-dollar makeover. MoMA, which moved here in 1939, has undergone remodeling 4 times to cope with a growing collection and increased footfall. This time, the layout reflects the philosophy of the museum's first director, Alfred Barr.
When the Museum of Modern Art in 1939 built its first building, what distinguished that building most from previous institutions was it wasn't set in a park and it wasn't set up a flight of steps.
The upgrade cost $450 million. It means the museum will be able to exhibit around 2,400 works a year compared to an average of 1,500. For the first time, artworks will be displayed by theme rather than time period.
This notion of democratizing the museum, of making that whole ground floor visible everywhere and free, is very much part of this sort of character that we wanted to bring out together.
For people wanting to see Pablo Picasso's iconic works, his Water Lilies and The Ladies of Avignon will always be on show.
Now, we'll be back with more news right after this break. Well, it's 26 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but we'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. Bye-bye.